All right, everyone. So today, let's talk about some things that you can do to help with your survivability in Raid Shadow Legends. Now, this is going to be especially useful if you find that champions are dying maybe a little bit too frequently when you are playing the game. Now, with that being said, a good offense in Raid Shadow Legends is going to end up being a good defense, and as you play the game, you will definitely find out how very true this is. Let's start off with tip number 1, and this is leading into what I just said right now. Very important, especially as you transition from the early game to the mid and the late game, and that is you are going to eventually want to switch out the core of your team from attack-based offensive champions to defense and HP scaling champions. Now, if you are newer, don't get this confused. Just because they are defense and HP scaling does not mean that they are going to be doing less damage. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The champions that scale off of defense and HP are some of the hardest hitters in the game and are actually going to be doing some of the biggest DPS numbers. The thing is, though, when you have champions that scale off of defense and HP, what that means is that not only is getting defensive stats for their gear going to increase their actual defenses, but because their skills are going to end up scaling off of that particular stat, like Sir Nicholas, for example, scales off of HP. When you end up gearing him for HP, not only are you going to increase his survivability, but because his skills scale off of HP, he's going to do more damage as well. When you have offensive attack-based champions, you're going to have to work on gearing out both offense and defensive stats in order to really have them be very viable in some of the most late-game content just because of how hard stuff hits. But when it comes to defensive and HP scaling champions, you only have to gear out one type of stat, whatever their defensive stat is, because not only is that going to end up giving them more defenses to help them survive in the later, more difficult content, but that defensive stat is also going to end up increasing their damage. And in a lot of tier lists, you'll find that a lot of the best champions in these tier lists are going to end up being defensive or HP based champions just because they stack up to the really difficult monsters of the late game content a lot better than offense champions. You're going to find that a lot of the offense champions, even though they might be really good and they might have amazing skills, they're going to be a lot more squishy, and it's going to be a lot easier for them to get killed in some of this more late game content. So this is definitely something you don't have to worry as much about it in the early game, and there's nothing wrong with having a couple of offense based champions, but you'll definitely find as you get to the later stages of the game, a lot of players, especially people on YouTube, you're probably going to notice a theme that a lot of their core team consists of defensive or HP based champions instead of offense based champions, and that's because of that reason being that offense based champions are just a lot more squishy and it's going to be a lot easier for them to get killed. So definitely going to be probably the most important overall tip when it comes to improving your team's survivability, but there are still plenty of other things that you can end up doing. And that leads into number 2. Now, of course, Lifesteal is an absolutely amazing gear set. This is going to tremendously increase your survivability, whether you use it on defensive HP or offensive attack-based champions. Either way, it's an absolutely fantastic gear set to help out your survivability, so definitely take advantage of it if you do have a bunch of lifesteal pieces. Even in the late game, lifesteal is still considered one of the best gear sets, and people will actually farm Dragon because one of the really good gear sets that it actually has is going to end up being that lifesteal gear set. Now, something else, a little bit of a hidden gem that a lot of people kind of forget, is that there is a pretty decent passive in the actual offensive tree that is also going to tremendously help out your survivability, and that is going to end up being the Life Drinker Mastery. Now, it's going to be in the 3rd row of the offensive mastery list right here. So if we go to masteries, it's going to be this passive right here. You might already have it, but don't forget how much this contributes to your survivability. It might not really seem like a lot. Heals by 5% of the damage inflicted when attacking with 50% HP or less. However, once you end up getting your passives like War Master or Giant Slayer, and with certain abilities on certain champions, even though it's only 5%, with those really big damage numbers that pop up, it ends up healing for quite a bit, and it definitely contributes to champion survivability a relatively large amount. So if you find that certain champions are dying a lot and you don't have this mastery, try adding it and see. It'll probably end up making a noticeable difference in your overall champion survivability. So that's definitely going to be another one to kind of tie alongside with the lifesteal set, because they both have very similar effects right there. Now moving on to the next thing on the list, and this is going to be extremely important, especially for those of you guys who are mid and late game players, something really easy to overlook that is going to tremendously increase your survivability, and I mean the difference is going to be night and day, and that is to make sure that you have the increased defense buff and the decreased attack debuff covered somewhere on your team. Now, of course, the increased defense buff is going to drastically decrease the amount of damage that you take, and the decreased attack debuff is going to drastically decrease the amount of damage that whatever enemies that you're facing are going to do. Now, this is going to be especially important for things like the clan boss. Major difference in how long you're going to end up surviving in the actual clan boss, and of course the longer that you end up surviving in the clan boss means that you're able to take more turns and end up doing more damage. But even outside of the clan boss and just regular dungeons and pretty much any content, make sure that you have those buffs and debuffs somewhere on your team if you find that you're having survivability issues. And again, the difference will end up being night and day, so that's definitely something to add to the list right there. Next up on the list is going to be try experimenting with adding some more support type champions to your team. Now, I always like to use Vrask as an example because I feel like he's a really unique champion with what he offers and that really cool heal, but there are plenty of other really awesome champions that are great for support. And I know this can be really difficult because you always want to try to fit as much DPS and as many damage dealing champions on your team as you possibly can, and a lot of the times it feels like support are pretty lackluster and they don't really end up offering a whole lot to your team besides that additional support. But if we just take Vrask as an example, when you take a look at him at first glance, he really doesn't have a super amazing skill kit. His first skill is not super insane, his second skill is not really super insane. It's really all about his passive right here, which is going to be his heal. But if built properly, his heal is so huge and can be such a game changer in your team that him actually staying alive and keeping your team alive for so much longer is going to significantly increase your DPS. That the difference in how much longer your team can stay alive and the difference in your overall survivability is going to end up making up for the lack of DPS that you actually get when you replace a DPS champion with somebody like Vrask on your team. So it's a balancing act, and that's the difficult thing about this. Not just Vrask, of course, that's just the champion that I ended up using as an example for this right here, but you kind of have to experiment around with this a little bit. Clan boss is not a bad place to do so because you can end up seeing how much you're going to end up gaining from survivability and the overall damage that you gain to your team versus what you end up losing. And, you know, you have to see whether it's worth taking out certain DPS champions and adding in certain support champions that are going to help out. Because, again, with no survivability, with your champions dead, you're not going to be doing any DPS at all. So it's going to be worth taking a little bit of a hit if you find that you're having issues with this and increase your overall damage by staying alive longer, of course. So that's going to end up being the fourth thing on the list right there. Now moving along to number 5, this is a really great one, something that if you are newer and you have not done yet, or at least tried doing, you're absolutely going to want to do so, and that is try putting a shield set on one of your HP scaling champions. You can put it on other champions, but I would highly recommend that you put it on an HP scaling champion. Now, it only lasts 3 turns per battle wave. It does refresh at the beginning of every wave in battle, but this could end up making a huge difference in your team survivability. And by huge, I mean absolutely game-changing. Now, if you don't know what the shield set actually does, it's pretty simple. But I can see how it might not be simple if you might be a little bit newer. But what the shield set does is at the beginning of your turn, at the beginning of a wave of battle, what it's going to do is it's going to put a shield on all of your allies, your entire team, based off of 30% of the HP of whatever champion is using the shield set. So if you place the shield set on a champion that has an insane amount of HP, it's going to add an insane shield to every champion on your team. Now, this is going to be obviously massive for your overall survivability. It does only end up lasting for 3 turns, but usually by the time 3 turns have gone by, you've done a lot of damage to whatever it is that you're facing. This is great for things like the arena as well, certain dungeon waves where you face trash waves, then another trash wave, and then the boss wave. Yes, it won't last for the entirety of the boss, but it'll still greatly improve your survivability for a good amount of the fight, to the point where it'll make a very big difference. So try this out. It is going to be one of the more difficult sets to get. You can still end up getting pieces of the shield set from the market, though. You can also end up getting it from the Fire Knight's castle, but try this tip out if you guys have it, and you'll probably notice that your survivability will skyrocket. So that's going to end up being number 5 on the list right there. All right, number 6, and this is going to be a really big one that I think a lot of people kind of overlook, and it has to do with just little differences in your overall stats. You know, things like your substats for your gear, using as good glyphs as you possibly can, your Great Hall bonus, climbing the arena. Don't forget, you actually gain a decent amount of champion HP just from climbing the arena. It goes all the way up to a 20% HP attack and defense bonus. I guess technically 25% if you're in platinum, but we'll leave that one out because not many people get platinum. So 20% for HP attack and defense in gold 4. That's a pretty decent amount. You can end up getting a good amount of stats and survivability in the Great Hall. A lot of the substats on gear that you just overlook, things that really honestly even aren't important, like flat HP. You never try to get flat HP on your substats, but it does happen. You just end up getting so many substats across all your pieces of gear. You're going to get a decent amount of survivability stats either way, whether you're trying to get them or not. And this can end up making a really big difference, especially on champions where you haven't specifically geared them out for survivability. Now, just as a little bit of an example here, I just threw some numbers up on the screen so you can get a little bit of an idea of what I'm saying here. So if you have a champion with 10,000 HP and you feel like you are struggling and you are dying, you know, half the time or so that you run a certain piece of content, you're dying, half the time you're not. If you add 5,000 HP, that's going to be a 50% increase, and that could easily end up making up the difference between you dying a decent amount of the time versus you not dying. Now, if you have a champion with 50,000 HP and you add that same amount of HP, it's only a 10% increase versus a 50% increase. So these little differences in stats make a huge difference if you haven't already specifically geared that champion out for survivability. So that's going to be a big one and a really important one if you're just on the edge. You're just at that point where you're dying a little bit, but sometimes you're not dying and you need that little bit of a boost to keep your champions alive. And finally, the last thing on the list is take a look at the champions that you have available. This is obviously going to be a bit different for everyone. Everyone is going to have a different roster of champions. And just see in the champions that you have available in their skill kit, what skills you feel are going to overall help with their survivability. Now, of course, this is going to be different for everyone, but there are some really interesting, unique skills that you might end up overlooking that are going to drastically change your team in Raid Shadow Legends. Vrask, of course, great example, very easy to overlook the power of this cannibalism skill right here. This skill is a game changer when it comes to having him help your overall team survivability. There are plenty of other champions as well that have very good defensive or utility-based skills. Some kind of ally protection skills can be really useful. Any kind of champions that have shield buffs as well is going to be huge for your overall survivability. Of course, buffs and debuffs, very, very important, but you're going to have to kind of take a look at this and piece it apart individually because everyone's going to have different champions. Now, your number one goal is going to be to beat the content and to survive. You should be working on this first before you move on to your second goal, and that is going to be to optimize your DPS and your clear times, but you can't really accomplish goal number 2 until you've accomplished goal number 1. So a good offense is going to end up being a good defense in Raid Shadow Legends. This game really rewards you for playing defensive-based characters, especially the way that HP and defensive-based characters scale. And of course, another final reminder that you don't do any DPS when you're dead in Raid Shadow Legends. So with that being said, that is going to be it for the video today. I hope that you guys enjoyed and that these tips helped out. And if you guys did enjoy this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. Really appreciate all the support, everyone. If you want to help out, tossing a quick like means more than you can imagine. And with that being said, some more Raid Shadow Legends videos should be popping up on the screen right about now. Have a great day, take care, and until next time, this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.